Hello and welcome back. I'm Christina, and this is the Wednesday Project. I'm really glad you're here today. Over the last few episodes, we've been slowly untangling something together. We talked about rejection, about how the ache of disconnection doesn't mean something's wrong with your faith, that your nervous system responding to rupture is not a spiritual failure. It's evidence that you were designed for connection. And then we talked about attachment, about how needing people isn't the same thing as making them an idol, that the line between healthy attachment and idolatry isn't about intensity. It's about whether you can stay with yourself while you need them. And if you've been sitting with those two conversations, really sitting with them, you might notice another question starting to surface, a quieter one. Okay, but shouldn't this be getting easier by now? If I'm growing, if I'm healing, if my faith is deepening and I'm doing the work, why do I still feel this much? Why does rejection still land the way it does? Why does grief still move through me in waves instead of dissolving cleanly? Why do certain relationships still carry this much weight? And underneath all of it, this quiet, persistent question: is the amount I feel evidence that I haven't healed enough yet? That's what I want to sit with today. I think most of us have inherited an idea about what spiritual and emotional maturity is supposed to look like. And the idea goes something like this: the more you grow, the less you feel. The more secure you become, the less things affect you. The deeper your faith goes, the quieter your interior life becomes. And so maturity gets measured by reduction, less sensitivity, less reactivity, less being moved. And I want to name where that idea came from because I don't think it necessarily came from scripture. I think it came from a version of stoicism that has quietly infiltrated Christian culture. The idea that the truly spiritual person rises above their emotions, that feeling deeply is somehow a sign of immaturity, that the goal is a kind of holy detachment from the things that used to hurt you. And I've sat with enough people in my work as a therapist to know what that looks like when it gets fully lived out. Imagine with me, if you will, a man who's been in church leadership for most of his adult life. I'm going to tell you a story that is essentially a composite of several instances that I've seen played out. So, this man who's been in church leadership, by every measure, he was solid. He was calm, steady, the person others came to when things fell apart. He had learned very early that being the stable one meant not being the one who struggled. That emotional composure was part of what made him trustworthy. That needing to process something meant you hadn't processed it enough. And he was good at it. So good that for years he genuinely believed he was doing well. Until one day, something happened that he couldn't manage his way through. And what came up underneath all that composure wasn't peace. It was grief. Years of it, carefully stored, neatly arranged, never brought into the light. He hadn't healed. He had learned to perform not hurting. And the performance had cost him something he hadn't even noticed he was losing, which was the ability to actually feel the life he was living. Maturity that looks like less is sometimes just shut down, wearing the right language. I want to take us to Isaiah 53. This is the passage that the early church read as a portrait of Jesus, written centuries before his birth. And yet, when you read it, knowing what you know, it is unmistakably him. And this is how it describes him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Hear that. A man of sorrows. Not a man who had risen above sorrow, not a man who had achieved the kind of detachment that made sorrow irrelevant. A man who knew grief from the inside, who was acquainted with it. The way you're acquainted with something you've lived near for a long time. That is the portrait Scripture gives us of the Son of God. And then Hebrews 4 takes that portrait and draws out its significance. It says, "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin." The word translated sympathize in the Greek is sympatheo, which means to feel alongside, to suffer with. The writer of Hebrews is making a specific claim. Jesus does not observe our pain from a safe distance. He's not emotionally unmoved and then choosing to help anyway. He feels alongside, which means emotional responsiveness is not a flaw in the system. It is part of what makes him the kind of priest he is. And then there is the moment we've touched on before, the tomb of Lazarus. Jesus arrives knowing exactly what he's about to do. He has the power. He has the knowledge. He has the plan. And he weeps. Not because he has forgotten who he is or what he's going to do. Not because his identity has come loose. Not because he lacks faith. But because he is present to what is in front of him. And what is in front of him is real grief. And real grief moves him. That is not insecurity. That is full presence. And in Gethsemane, the night he knows what's coming, he says to his disciples, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me. Stay with me." He does not manage his way through the garden alone. He asks to be accompanied. He names the weight. He brings the full reality of his interior world into that space. If security meant feeling less, he would have been the clearest example of that. He is not. He is the clearest example of something else entirely. Feeling fully and remaining anchored at the same time. So let me try to put this into something more concrete. Security doesn't reduce what you feel. It changes what you do with it. When your identity is not constantly being negotiated by what's happening around you, when you're not depending on everything going well to feel okay about who you are, you don't have to defend yourself against what you feel. You don't have to shut it down or explain it away or manage it into a shape that makes you feel more acceptable. You can let it be there, existing, which sounds simple, and it's not simple. Because for a lot of us, letting a feeling be there doesn't feel like strength. It feels like losing control. It feels like if we let the grief in, it will flood. If we let the loneliness, name itself, it will never leave. If we let the pain have space, it will take over the whole room. And that fear makes a lot of sense if you've never had someone sit with you in the middle of it. If you've never had the experience of feeling something hard and discovering that it passed, that you were still there on the other side, that the feeling moved through rather than defining you. That's what secure attachment teaches the nervous system. Not that hard things don't happen, not that pain is avoidable, but that pain can be survived, that you are not alone in it, that you will still be yourself when it passes. And when that gets internalized, in therapy we call it integrated, slowly over time through real experience, something shifts. Not in how much you feel, but in how much space you have to feel it. So here's what I actually think changes as you become more secure. Not the presence of pain, but what the pain does to you. When you are less secure, pain tends to move in a very particular direction. Something hurts, and almost immediately, faster than you can track, it becomes a story. This hurts, which means something is wrong, which means something's wrong with me, which means I am too much or not enough or fundamentally unlovable. The pain doesn't stay pain. It becomes a verdict. And once it becomes a verdict, you're no longer just feeling something. You're managing a conclusion about who you are as a person. And that's exhausting in a way that just feeling pain is not. Because pain is survivable. But a verdict about your worth feels like it has to be either proven or defended against. And neither of those things actually brings relief. When you are more secure, the pain is still there. I want to be clear about that. Security doesn't cushion the impact. It doesn't make rejection sting less in the moment it arrives. But there's something that happens in the aftermath. The pain stays pain. It doesn't automatically become a story about your worth. It doesn't immediately collapse inward into a verdict about who you are. There is, and this is the only word I have for it, space. Space between the feeling and the interpretation of the feeling. Space to notice, this hurts, without the automatic next step, and therefore I'm broken. Space to hold grief without it deciding who you are. That space is not the absence of pain. That space is what security looks like from the inside. And that space, I want to name this carefully, is exactly what Psalm 34 is pointing to. The Lord is near to the brokenhearted. He saves those who are crushed in spirit. Not he removes the brokenness, not he makes the heartbreak disappear, but near, present in the pain, present to the pain, close to the one who's in it. promise of Psalm 34 is not that you won't be brokenhearted. It is that when you are not alone there. And then Romans 8 takes that even further. Paul writes that the Spirit intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. Groanings, not tidy prayers, not composed requests, but something that happens beneath language in the places where we don't have words for what we're carrying. The Spirit is present in the wordless parts, in the grief that hasn't found its voice yet, in the ache that you don't know how to name. The goal of faith was never to get you out of that place. It was to make sure you were never alone in it. So, the goal is not to feel less. The goal is to become someone who can feel without being consumed, who can hold grief without turning it into a verdict, who can sit with loneliness without it rewriting who you are, who can feel the ache of rejection and stay anchored at the same time. Not because the pain doesn't matter, but because you have enough ground beneath you to stand on while the feeling moves through. And that kind of groundedness, it's not built in a day. It is not built by reading the right things or having the right theology or praying in the right way. It is built in the slow accumulation of experiences where you felt something hard and stayed with it and discovered you were still there on the other side. Where you brought the grief to God and found He was already there. Where you named the ache honestly, the way the psalmist did, and found that the naming itself was kind of a relief. Where you let someone sit with you in the hard parts and found that being witnessed didn't make you weaker. It made you more yourself. If you're someone who still feels things deeply, who still carries the weight of certain moments longer than you think you should, who wonders sometimes whether the amount you feel is evidence that you haven't grown enough, I want you to hear this. That is not a failure of your growth. It may actually be evidence of it because you are no longer performing okayness. You are no longer managing your way past what you feel. You're staying with it. And that, as quiet as it sounds, is the work. Isaiah called Jesus a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, not someone who had moved beyond grief, but someone who had learned to remain inside of it without losing himself. That is the model, and that's the invitation. Not to feel less, but to stay. Until next Wednesday, feel what is real. Stay with yourself. He is already near.